democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We've flown from Washington, D.C. from the inauguration to Park City, Utah, to cover the Sundance Film Festival. It's the 10th anniversary of the documentary track. And we're going to start off by getting response to President Obama's inaugural address. On Monday, President Obama declared a decade of war is now ending and that lasting peace does not require perpetual war. But he never mentioned the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan by name. There was also no mention about the secret drone war that's vastly expanded under President Obama. On the same day he gave his inaugural address, a U.S. drone strike killed 3 people in Yemen, east of the capital, Sana'a. Also Monday, President Obama officially nominated John Brennan to be director of the CIA, succeeding retired Army General David Petraeus, who resigned. Nicknamed the assassination czar by some, Brennan was the first Obama administration official to publicly confirm drone attacks overseas and to defend their legality. 4 years ago, John Brennan was a rumored pick for the CIA job when Obama was first elected, but was forced to withdraw from consideration amidst protests over his role at the CIA under the Bush administration. Obama also officially nominated Chuck Hagel to head defense and John Kerry to become Secretary of State on Monday. Well, joining us here in Park City, Utah, is Jeremy Scahill, national security correspondent for The Nation magazine. He's featured in and co-wrote the new documentary, Dirty Wars: The World is a Battlefield. Jeremy's latest book with the same title is due out in April. We're also joined by Dirty Wars director Richard Rowley, independent journalist with Big Noise Films. The film premiered here at the Sundance Film Festival in the U.S. documentary competition section. And when we flew into Salt Lake City last night, we went directly to the Salt Lake City Library, where there was a packed, sold-out crowd to see the a showing of Dirty Wars. We want to congratulate you, Jeremy and Rick, on this absolutely remarkable film. And I think it's very appropriate to begin our 4 days of broadcasting here at Park City on this day after the inauguration of President Obama, to begin with Dirty Wars: The World is a Battlefield. Jeremy, talk about President Obama's first 4 years and where we're going now. You got a chance to hear his inaugural address, so what you thought of it.
Well, you know, I think if we look back at the first term of the Obama administration, what we saw was you had this very popular Democratic president who had campaigned in terms of his broader rhetoric during the presidential campaign against John McCain on the notion that he was going to transform the way that the U.S. conducted its foreign policy around the world. And you know, he then proceeded to double down on some of the greatest excesses of the Bush administration. If you look at the use of the state secrets privilege, if you look at the way the Obama administration has expanded the drone wars, has empowered special operations forces, including from JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, to operate in countries where the United States is not at war. If you look at the way in which the Obama administration has essentially boxed Congress out of any effective oversight role of the covert aspects of U.S. foreign policy, what we really have is a president who has normalized for many, many liberals in the United States the policies that they once opposed under the Bush administration. And you know, this really has been a war presidency. And you know, yesterday, as President Obama is talking about how we don't need a state of perpetual war, multiple U.S. drone strikes in Yemen, a country that we're not at war with, where the U.S. has killed a tremendous number of civilians. Rick and I have spent a lot of time on the ground in Yemen. And you know, to me, most disturbing about this is John Brennan, who really was the architect of this drone program and the expansion of the drone program. These guys are sitting around on Tuesdays at the White House in Terror Tuesday meetings discussing who's going to live and who's going to die across the world. These guys have decided.
What do you mean Terror Tuesday meeting?
Well, that's what they're referred to. When this first came out, senior White House officials said that they internally refer to them as Terror Tuesdays, where they meet and they go over the list of potential targets, and they have them, on baseball cards in some cases, and they're identifying people that they want to take out and that are on the U.S. kill list. And we have an ever-expanding kill list. You know, after 9/11, there were 7 people on the U.S. kill list, and then we had the deck of cards in Iraq and Saddam and his top people. I mean, now there are thousands. It's unknown how many people are on this kill list, and U.S. citizens, 3 U.S. citizens were killed in operations ordered by the president in late 2011, including, you know, as we reported on Democracy Now! Before, the 16-year-old Abdulrahman al-Awlaki. And you know, so the appointment of Brennan to CIA, to me, is the greatest symbol of how deeply invested in covert war and an expansion of wars around the world, and the notion that was popularized under the neocons of the world as a battlefield. That notion that the United States can strike in any country across the world, wherever it determines that terrorists or suspected militants may reside. The most disturbing part of this policy to me, and I think also to people within the intelligence community who are looking at this, is that there are regions of Yemen or Pakistan where President Obama has authorized the U.S. to strike, even if they don't know the identities of the people that they're striking, the so-called signature strike policy. The idea that being a military-aged male in a certain region of a particular country around the world, that those people become legitimate targets based on their gender and their age and their geographic presence, that those are going to be legitimate targets.
Explain that.
Well, I mean, this was something that started under the Bush administration, and when President Obama first took office, he was briefed on this by the then director, the outgoing director of the CIA, Michael Hayden, and he described to him this policy that they had developed called signature strikes, where they were looking at patterns of life. If an individual had contact with certain other individuals, if they were traveling in a certain area at certain times, if they were gathering with a certain number of people, that there was a presumption that they must be up to no good, that they're suspected militants or suspected terrorists, and that the U.S. could take preemptive action against those people. And by preemptive action, I mean killing them with a missile, that there was authorization to do that. And in some cases, the president has actually pre-cleared the CIA to authorize these strikes without being directly notified. But President Obama, my understanding from sources within the intelligence and military world, has really sort of micromanaged this process. And Brennan's basically the hitman of this administration, except he never has to go out and do the hitting himself. He orders, planes and missile strikes and AC-130 strikes to, hit in Somalia, in Yemen, in Pakistan. We're looking right now at a reality that President Obama has essentially extended the very policies that many of his supporters once opposed under President Bush. And I think it says something about the bankrupt nature of partisan politics in this country, that the way we feel about life or death policies around the world is determined by who happens to be in office. I mean, that to me is a very sobering reality.
I wanted to go to a first clip of your film, Jeremy and Rick. The story of Muslim cleric Anwar al-Awlaki features prominently in Dirty Wars. His 16-year-old son became the 3rd U.S. citizen to be killed in a drone strike in Yemen in October 2011. President Obama called the assassination of Anwar al-Awlaki a, quote, milestone.
Aden. Yemen's ancient port city was nothing like Kabul. In Afghanistan, life was defined by the war. Everything revolved around it. But in Yemen, there was no war, at least not officially. The strike seemed to have come out of the blue, and most Yemenis were going about life as usual. It was difficult to know where to start. The Yemeni government claimed responsibility for the strikes, saying they'd killed dozens of al-Qaeda operatives, but it was unclear who the targets really were, or who was even responsible.
That's Jeremy Scahill in Yemen, in the film that has just premiered at the Sundance Film Festival called Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield. Jeremy.
So what we were seeing there was a scene where we're first getting into what's happening on the ground in Yemen, and we learn about this series of missile strikes, cruise missile strikes that had happened in December of 2009, the first time that Yemen had been bombed by the United States in 7 years. And in the process of looking at who the targets were, we understood that Anwar al-Awlaki, that there had been an attempt to kill him, and in fact that it had been announced that al-Awlaki had been killed, and that's how we discovered that Anwar al-Awlaki was in fact on the kill list. And of course, Anwar al-Awlaki is a U.S. citizen. The first bombing that happened on December 17th, 2009, where President Obama directly authorized the strike, was on this village of Al-Majla in southern Yemen, and 46 people were killed, including 24 women and children in that strike. And so what Rick and I did is we went down to the heart of where these strikes were happening, and we met with people on the ground, and we interviewed survivors of these missile strikes, and we gathered evidence, and we actually filmed the cruise missile parts. And the U.S. did not claim responsibility for those strikes. In fact, the Yemeni government claimed responsibility for the strikes. And we know from the WikiLeaks cables that were released that General David Petraeus essentially conspired with senior Yemeni officials, including the former president of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, to cover up the U.S. role in what would become a very rapidly expanding U.S. bombing campaign inside of Yemen. And this administration has continued to pummel Yemen. Today they claimed for probably the dozenth time in the past couple of years to have killed Saeed al-Shiri, one of the leaders of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And maybe he has been killed this time, maybe he hasn't. But what we saw on the ground is that the United States and Yemen claim to be killing al-Qaeda leadership, and they've killed a handful of them in Yemen. But for the most part, it seems that the drone strikes are hitting in areas where they're killing civilians. And what it's doing is it's turning people in Yemen that might not be disposed to have anything against the United States into potential enemies that have a legitimate grudge against America. And we saw that repeatedly.
Rick Rowley, your filmmaking is truly remarkable, and you've shown that in your previous films, for example, Fourth World War. But in Dirty Wars, that you take this one camera and you and Jeremy travel the world, as you've been covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for years, going to places that the entire U.S. press corps, I mean, with their armed guards, has rarely been, if ever at all, to track what has been secret until now. Talk about that journey through Yemen.
Yeah, the global war on terror is the most important story of our generation, and it's a story that's been completely not covered. It remains invisible and hidden from most Americans. I mean, this is the longest war in American history. It's a war in which hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, but it's happening in the shadows. And so in Dirty Wars, Jeremy and I are trying to make this invisible war that's being fought in our name, but without our knowledge, visible to the American people. And in order to do that, we had to leave the safety of the green zone and go out to where the war takes place. Talk to the civilians on the ground in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen about how this war is affecting their lives. So in Yemen, as a result of all these drone strikes, the backlash against these drone strikes in the south was huge. When we arrived in Yemen, an entire province in the south had been taken over by an al-Qaeda-affiliated organization because of all the massive popular anger over the drone strikes and the government's complicity in the strikes, which turned the south of Yemen into a terrifying place. I mean, these missile strikes, these night raids, destabilize the countries that they happen in, and they turn them into places where it becomes very dangerous to move and to operate. So in Yemen, I mean, in Afghanistan as well, Jeremy and I had to travel. It was only possible for us to work as a crew of two because we had to keep a low profile and try to travel under the radar. We couldn't rolling around with security would only make it more dangerous for us.
Rick had to actually, he had to train one of our Afghan colleagues in how to use a second camera so that we could have someone filming me while Rick was filming the people that we were interviewing, because it wouldn't have been safe to bring more people than that. So Rick actually was training people on the fly in multiple countries on how to do other things because of some of the limitations for security purposes of having to travel very lightly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that humbles both of us is that when you arrive in a village in Afghanistan and knock on someone's door, you're the first American they've seen since the Americans that kicked that door in and killed half their family. And yet, time and time again, those families invited us in, welcomed us, and shared their stories with us. Based on, we promised them that we would do everything we could to make their stories be heard in the U.S. And so it's actually it's amazing to be here at Sundance because finally we're able to keep those promises.
Afghanistan, Gardez, Jeremy, talk about one of the central focuses of Dirty Wars.
Yeah, when we began working on this film, it was a very different film. Amy, both Rick and I have been on Democracy Now! I mean, I feel like I grew up at Democracy Now! On my Facebook page, I list Democracy Now! As my university, and really view it that way. And because we were talking to you at the time that we had started on a very different journey, and we had read about this raid that happened in Gardez in Paktia province because a very, very brave reporter named Jerome Starkey, who's a correspondent for the Times of London, who now is in Africa covering the latest sort of expansion of the not-so-covert war in Mali.
And we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah. So we had read about this night raid that took place, and it was a horrible massacre. And what happened in Gardez was that U.S. Special Operations Forces had intelligence that there were a Taliban cell was in was having some sort of a meeting to prepare a suicide bomber, and they raid this house in the middle of the night, and they end up killing 5 people, including 3 women, 2 of whom were pregnant, and another person that they killed in the house, Mohammed Daoud, turned out to be a senior Afghan police commander who had been trained by the U.S., including by the mercenary or the private security company, MPRI, Military Professional Resources Incorporated. They weren't even Pashtun, the dominant, the almost exclusive ethnicity of the Taliban. They spoke Dari, and what was happening that night was not preparing a suicide bomber. They were celebrating the birth of a child, and they were dancing and had music, and they had women without head covers on, and so the soldiers raid this house and they kill these people, and instead of realizing that they had made a horrible mistake and that the intelligence was wrong and it resulted in these people being killed, they actually covered up the killings. And we interviewed the survivors of this raid, including a man who watched while he was zip-cuffed American soldiers digging bullets out of his wife's dead body. And they then tried to...
And they did that because?
Well, so just to finish this part of it, they kill the people, they dig the bullets out of the bodies, then they take into custody all of the men of the house, including a man who's just watched his sister and his wife and his niece killed, and they fly them to a different province, and they're interrogating them, trying to get them to give up some information that would indicate that the Taliban had a connection to that family. I mean, it shows you how horrid the intelligence is. I mean, these people weren't even Pashtun. You have a senior police commander. They're dancing, playing loud music, and they have women without head cover in the house. And what happened is that NATO then issues a press release and made statements anonymously in the media where they said that the U.S. forces had stumbled upon the aftermath of a Taliban honor killing. And they implied that the family, that the women were killed by their own murderous families. And so in the course of the film, we investigate that night raid, and we learn that the individuals who did that raid were members of the Joint Special Operations Command. And we know that because the then head of the Joint Special Operations Command, Vice Admiral William McRaven, showed up in this village with scores of Afghan soldiers and U.S. forces, and there's a scene, and we show this in the film, where they offload a sheep, and they offer to sacrifice the sheep to say, you know, to ask for forgiveness. It's a Afghan cultural tradition, and it was meant to be a gesture of reconciliation. And they offload the sheep, and they're offering to sacrifice it in the very place where the raid had taken place. And then Admiral McRaven goes into the home and says his men were responsible for killing the women and the police commander, and he asked for forgiveness from the head of the family, Haji Sharabuddin. Had a brave photographer named Jeremy Kelly not been there to snap the photographs that you see in our film of Admiral McRaven in Gardez, we may never have known who the actual killers were that day. And both Jerome Starkey and I have filed Freedom of Information Act requests. We've tried to get information out of the U.S. military. My requests have been bounced all around the military, and the most current update I have is months old from them. They said that it's in an unnamed agency awaiting review. We don't know if anyone was disciplined for the action. We don't know if anyone was ever held accountable for the action. All we know is that Admiral McRaven and a bunch of soldiers showed up with a sheep and said, we did this and we're sorry.
And tried to destroy Jerome Starkey's reputation, meanwhile, back in Kabul at the news conference.
Jerome Starkey, there's a couple of journalists in our film who really emerge as the heroes of the story that we're telling. Another one is currently in jail in Yemen right now, and we can maybe talk about him, named Abdullah Haider Shaya, and we've talked about him on the show before, in jail because President Obama intervened when he was about to be pardoned to keep him in jail after he exposed the U.S. role in certain missile strikes.
What do you mean he intervened, if you could just say for a moment?
I mean, there was the journalist who first exposed the missile strike I was talking about earlier in Al-Majala, Yemen. Abdullah Haider Shaya had taken photographs of the U.S. missile parts, and that's how we first learned that it was in fact U.S. cruise missiles, and Yemen doesn't have cruise missiles. And so after he did his reporting and continued to report on the expanding U.S. air war in Yemen, he was snatched from his home by the U.S.-backed Yemeni counterterrorism units, and then was put on trial for allegedly being an al-Qaeda facilitator or propagandist, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. There was huge protests as his trial was denounced as a sham by international human rights and media organizations, and he was about to be pardoned by the Yemeni president because there was tremendous pressure in the country. And then President Obama called President Ali Abdullah Saleh and expressed his concern over the release of Abdullah Haider Shaya. The reporter. And then the pardon was ripped up after that. And his lawyers say clearly that he's in jail because of Obama's intervention, that he would have been released. Unless you think this is some kind of a conspiracy theory, you can hop onto the White House website and see the readout of the phone call from that day. The White House put it openly. When I called the State Department to ask them about the case, they said, we stand by President Obama's initial position on this regarding this journalist. And they don't even refer to him as a journalist regarding this individual. He had worked with ABC News, The Washington Post, very small unknown media outlets. And I heard from someone inside of a very prominent news organization in the U.S. told me that they had been called by the administration when they were working with Abdullah Haider Shaya and told that you should stop working with him because he takes his paychecks and gives them to al-Qaeda. I mean, they try to slander this journalist behind the scenes and in front. But you asked about Jerome Starkey. When Jerome Starkey first exposed the cover-up of Gardez, NATO publicly attacked him by name and accused him of lying. And then when more information started to come out about who did it, then they changed their story, but they never apologized to Jerome Starkey.
And Rick Rowley, you have this remarkable footage, aside from you both going to Gardez and interviewing the survivors. Talk about the video footage you retrieved there and the hands of the U.S. soldiers that you see.
Yeah, one of the incredible things in Gardez, the family gave us cell phone videos that they had taken the night of the raid. And there was one clip in particular that was early in the morning. It's a shaky video, and we just thought it was just another sort of shaky video of the bodies. But then you can hear voices come over it, and they're American accented voices speaking about piecing together their version of the night's killings, getting their story straight. And I mean, you hear them trying to concoct a story about how this was something other than a massacre.
And you see their hands.
And you see their hands moving the corpses around and photographing the bullet holes. But we never get to see their faces. All we have are their voices. We spent a long time actually trying to analyze the audio to figure out, because a name is mentioned in one part of it, but it's too thin and distorted on a cell phone to find out. I mean, these are the scraps and pieces that we have to use to reconstruct the story of these wars, because everything is systematically hidden from us. I mean, all we had to go on were these pictures that Jeremy Kelly took, this cell phone video, and
Jeremy Kelly is the photographer, videographer for Jerome Starkey.
Yes. Who's now the Kabul
Afghan correspondent.
Yeah. All we had were these tiny little scraps of clues that weren't even supposed to exist, and pictures of a person who was unknown at the time. I mean, Admiral William McRaven. No one knew who he was. I mean, that was the first sort of shock. You looked at him, see his rank, read his name, but he wasn't from the NATO command. He wasn't from the Eastern Regional Command that owns the battle space. He was not even, I mean, why was this elite force operating, kicking in the doors on farmers? I mean, that is the sort of the mystery that begins the investigation.
And then you take this forward, Jeremy, back to the United States and show McRaven a photograph.
Right, and so we're, after we learned that this figure, William McRaven, was the leader of this raid, our film was sort of, and this journey was sort of like pulling on the tail of an elephant that's behind a hidden wall, and you're pulling on it, and the cracks start to show this behemoth that's behind a wall, and you realize that this is part of a much bigger story, and really that kicked off a journey that took us to Yemen and Somalia and elsewhere. And for us, I mean, just this incredible looking glass moment happened when Osama bin Laden is killed, and all of a sudden everyone is talking about JSOC. It's everywhere. I mean, we had spent so much time embedded in this story where there was very little being written about it except for a small circle of journalists, and all of a sudden the people whose journey we'd been tracking had become national heroes. And Disney tried to trademark SEAL Team 6, and the Hollywood producers got in bed with the CIA to make their version of the events, the sort of official history.
And you're saying that's the film?
Well, Zero Dark 30. I mean, and we can talk about that film later. But I mean, the relationship between the CIA and Hollywood over this issue is one that I think needs to be very, very thoroughly debated, and I'm thankful that we are debating it. And one great thing that has happened as a result of Zero Dark 30 is that people are actually talking about torture and what has happened in the past. But for us to see McRaven then sitting in front of Congress and JSOC being talked about publicly was really an incredible experience, because we had seen this other side. Our film is about all these things that these same units did that almost never get talked about. What Americans know about JSOC is overwhelmingly limited to what happened in the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. And Rick often points out sort of the irony of the way that's covered versus the role these forces play around the world.
Yeah, I mean, we're flooded with details about one raid on May 2nd, 2011. We know everything about it. We know how many SEALs were in the helicopters. We know what kind of helicopters they were. We know what kind of rifles they were carrying. We know that they had a dog with them that was a Belgian Malinois named Cairo. We know everything about this raid. But that same year, there were 30,000 other night raids in Afghanistan. So we know everything about this, but those are all hidden from us.
We're going to break and then come back to a pair of remarkable investigative journalists whose investigations are now a film, Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield, that has just premiered here at the Sundance Film Festival in its 10th year. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.